London is still awake, but it has misplaced its edges. In the great fog of 1873, the city's familiar streets soften into silence, and every corner becomes a question asked in whispers. Tonight, it will not be lanterns or maps that guide the lost, but the calm steadiness of human voices, slow, warm, and sure as a hand held out in the darkened white. The fog arrived the way a careful hand might draw a veil across a mirror, without hurry, without drama, and with a strange courtesy that made the familiar look newly composed. At first, it was only a pale thickness along the river and the lower streets, a mild blur that softened the hard lines of stone and iron. But as evening deepened, it gathered itself and spread with quiet determination, filling alleys and widening into squares, settling upon roof lines and window ledges as though it had been invited. The gas lamps continued to burn, faithful as ever, yet their light seemed to shrink, becoming small halos that hovered close to the glass, unwilling to travel far. London, so often a city of angles and confident noise, began to sound as if it were listening to itself. Edmund Hale noticed it at the lodging house door, where the air usually carried the straightforward sense of coal smoke and damp wool. He was a night porter by trade and temperament, a man who preferred steadiness to spectacle, and who found comfort in the repetition of simple duties. The lodging house, Hale and Sons, though Edmund was neither a son nor a proprietor, stood on a side street that was ordinarily easy to place by memory alone. A familiar rhythm lived there, the scrape of boots on stone, the occasional rumble of a cart, the murmur of late conversations drifting from a public house at the corner. Tonight, those sounds felt padded, as if someone had laid down thick cloth over the city's usual furniture. He took his position behind the front desk as he always did, under the warm glow of the lamp that made the polished wood look almost honey-colored. The guest ledger lay open, its lines neat, its ink still faintly sharp. Keys hung on their hooks in orderly rows, and the brass bell on the counter, rarely rung with enthusiasm, waited with quiet patience. Edmund had been listening, as he often did, to the small language of the house. A stair creak that meant someone had turned in for the night, a latch click that meant someone had stepped out for one last errand. When the fog thickened, those sounds remained, but the world beyond the front door seemed to withdraw, like a tide sliding gently away from shore. After a while, curiosity nudged him, softly, the way it did with Edmund, never in a shove. He set his pen down with care, straightened his waistcoat, and walked to the door. The glass panel was already milked over, the street lamp outside reduced to a pale coin. He opened the door a few inches and let the air touch his face. It felt cool, faintly wet, and astonishingly still. The fog did not rush in, it simply waited, as though it belonged to the threshold as much as he did. On the step, Edmund stood with his hands loosely clasped behind him and breathed in, testing the night's character. The street lay only a few feet away, yet it seemed further than usual, its details folded into a single pale surface. A lamppost was present only as a suggestion, darkness shaped into a vertical line. Somewhere beyond, a horse gave a low, patient snort, and the sound seemed to travel oddly, arriving from the wrong direction, as if the fog had gently turned it about. Edmund felt no alarm in it, only a mild disorientation, the sensation of being in a room where someone had quietly moved the chairs. Across a few blocks, Clara Wren was closing her stall earlier than she liked. By daylight, her little corner near the market was a cheerful business of ribbons, small notions, and neatly folded cloth. She sold practical goods, but she arranged them with an eye for beauty, as though usefulness deserved grace. Clara's hands were quick and sure, and her voice, when she spoke to customers, carried a calm brightness that made even the most ordinary purchase feel like a friendly exchange. Tonight, the fog had altered the market's mood. The last customers had drifted away with polite apologies, and the usual lively calls had quieted to murmurs. Even the cobblestones seemed softened, their damp sheen swallowed by the whiteness pressing close. She tied the final knot on the canvas cover and secured it, taking an extra moment to check every fastening, as if thoroughness might keep the fog from creeping into her stock. When she stepped back, the stall's outline blurred at the edges, and her own breath appeared as a faint cloud joining the larger one. Clara drew her shawl closer, not because she was cold, though she was, but because the gesture felt sensible. She had grown up in London. She knew its habits. Fog was not new to her. Yet this was something denser, more complete, as if the city had decided, for one night, to keep its secrets softly to itself. She turned to look down the street toward the familiar landmarks she usually used without thinking. The corner shop with its striped awning, the iron rail by the steps, the lantern that hung outside the public house. Tonight, each marker seemed to hover at the edge of recognition, half present, half imagined. Clara listened instead. A distant footstep, careful and measured. The faint creak of a sign swinging somewhere. The soft exhale of a carriage passing slowly, its wheels a muted whisper on wet stone. Sounds felt like the only reliable thread, as though London had traded sight for hearing and expected everyone to adapt with good manners. Clara began to walk, not briskly, but with a deliberate pace that matched the night. Each step was placed as though she were learning the street anew. She kept her chin level and her gaze gentle, not searching frantically, simply observing what the fog allowed. The gas lamps made small circles of warmth on the pavement, and she moved from one to the next as if crossing stones in a shallow stream. Between the pools of light, the whiteness thickened, and her own shadow disappeared, leaving her feeling oddly unaccompanied by herself. At the lodging house, Edmund lingered on the step longer than usual. He had intended only to confirm what the air was doing and then return to his desk, but the street's altered quiet held his attention. He watched a figure pass at a careful pace, only a silhouette, not close enough to identify, and then it was swallowed again. Another figure paused nearer, as though uncertain where the road continued, and then moved on, slower still. Edmund's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with focus, as if he were listening with his gaze. He closed the door gently behind him and remained in the narrow entry, where the lamplight from inside could still reach. There was a particular quiet that comes to a building that shelters people. It is not silence exactly, but a kind of shared agreement to be soft. Edmund considered the fog as he might consider an unexpected guest, not unwelcome, but requiring a different sort of attention. He went back to the desk and made sure the lamp was turned up enough to be welcoming without being harsh. The small warm circle it cast felt, suddenly, like a promise. Outside, Clara reached the edge of the market street and paused where the pavement widened. In clearer weather, she could have seen the turn she needed, but tonight, the corner was more suggestion than certainty. She waited, listening, letting her breath settle into an even rhythm. Then she heard something that made her lift her head. A scattered pattern of footsteps, not steady like someone walking home, but hesitant, stopping and starting, as if the person were consulting a map that could not be read. The steps drifted closer, then stalled. Clara did not call out. She simply stood, attentive, her posture open, her expression composed, as though she were prepared to answer a question in a shop. The footsteps resumed, closer now, and she caught the faint sound of a small sigh. The fog, for all its thickness, could not muffle that human note of uncertainty. Clara's fingers curled lightly around the edge of her shawl, and she made a decision as simple as closing a latch. If someone needed a steady voice tonight, she could offer one. At the lodging house counter, the brass bell remained untouched, but Edmund heard another sound, subtle, near the front door. It was not the confident rap of someone arriving with a reservation, nor the casual push of a regular guest returning late. It was a gentler knock, careful as a question. Edmund's gaze moved to the door, and he felt a small shift in the evening's shape, as if the fog outside had sent the first message of the night. He rose, smoothed his sleeve, and walked toward the entrance with unhurried certainty. As he reached for the latch, he noticed how quiet his own footsteps sounded on the polished floor, and how the whole house seemed to hold its breath, not in tension, but in attentive calm. He opened the door, and the fog waited on the other side, pale and patient, carrying with it the presence of someone just beyond the threshold. Edmund's voice, when he spoke, was steady and warm, like lamplight on wood. "Good evening," he said, and in the whiteness, the words seemed to matter. Outside, Clara took a small step toward the uncertain footsteps, preparing to speak with the same gentle firmness. In a city that had misplaced its streets, voices would have to become landmarks, and kindness would have to travel farther than light. The night, it seemed, was inviting London to move differently, more slowly, more carefully, and together. The figure on the step remained mostly a suggestion at first, coat and hat shaped from the fog's pale density. Yet Edmund could sense the careful patience in the way the person waited. When the door opened wider, a faint curl of cooler air entered the lodging house, carrying the clean, damp scent of stone after mist. Edmund kept one hand on the latch and let the lamplight spill outward, though it seemed to hesitate at the threshold, as if the fog were politely asking it not to wander too far. "Good evening," he repeated, not louder than before, and the steadiness of his tone did something simple and immediate. It gave the night a reference point. A man's voice answered from the whiteness, soft with embarrassment, as though he had arrived at the wrong house by choice. He explained, without unnecessary details, that he had meant to reach a friend's rooms a few streets away, but the fog had rearranged his sense of distance. He had turned once, then again, and afterward, the names of roads he knew well had seemed to unfasten from their corners. Edmund listened without hurrying the explanation along. The porter had met many kinds of late arrivals, travelers delayed by trains, clerks who had worked past the last bus, young men who tried to appear certain when they were not. This voice held no drama, only the small ache of being uncertain in a city that usually rewarded confidence. Edmund leaned forward slightly, keeping his posture relaxed, and asked a few quiet questions. What street the man had last been sure of, what he could hear nearby, whether he remembered passing any particular lamp or railing. The questions were practical, but the way Edmund asked them carried a calmer message beneath the words. There was no shame in pausing, and no need to force the night into obedience. As the man answered, his voice steadied. He admitted he could hear the faint rumble of carts somewhere, and, more helpfully, a distant pub tune, muffled and slow, as if played through cloth. Edmund nodded, mapping sound in his mind the way some men mapped rooftops. "The fog is thick tonight," Edmund said, and the sentence, spoken as a simple fact rather than a complaint, seemed to ease the air between them. "If you like, step closer to the lamp. You don't need to stand out there alone." The man did not cross the threshold immediately. He hesitated, as though entering a stranger's doorway required permission beyond words. Edmund offered it by shifting slightly aside, opening space rather than pressing. A moment later, the man came nearer, and the lamplight found his sleeves and the edge of his hat, making him suddenly more real, as if he had been waiting to be named by warmth. Outside, the fog accepted the small retreat of light without protest. It lingered at the doorway like a guest who would not be offended by being kept in the hall. While Edmund spoke in the lodging house's gentle entry, Clara stood at the market's edge and let her attention travel along the pavement by sound. The hesitant footsteps she had noticed were joined now by another pair, lighter, quickened, then slowed again, as though the second person had realized that speed had no advantage tonight. Shapes moved in and out of the nearest lamp's circle. A shoulder, a sleeve, the brief, bright flicker of a button catching light. It reminded Clara of watching fish pass beneath ice, close enough to sense but impossible to count. She waited until one of the figures paused near her, and then she spoke in the calmest voice she owned, the one she used when a customer seemed flustered by too many choices. "Good evening," she said plainly, as if the fog were merely an inconvenient crowd. "Are you looking for a particular turn?" A woman's voice answered, then a man's, both quiet, cautious, and grateful to find a solid point to speak toward. They had been heading for a familiar crossing, but the street's breadth had confused them. Every direction looked like the next, and even the lamps felt oddly spaced. Clara asked them to remain where they were for a moment, not because she meant to command them, but because stillness could be a tool. "Listen," she suggested, and though the word was simple, it carried a kind of permission. They listened. A cart creaked somewhere in the near distance, slow and careful. A door latched shut. Somewhere farther off, a bell gave a single note, soft enough that the fog seemed to absorb its edges, leaving only a rounded sound that could not quite decide how far away it was. Clara described what she knew in measured phrases. She spoke of the market behind them, of the way the cobblestones shifted slightly underfoot near the drainage channel, of the iron post that marked the corner. As she spoke, the fog did not clear, but it felt less absolute, as if her words drew faint chalk lines on an unseen slate. The pair moved closer, not rushing, simply choosing to be nearer to the voice that made sense. Clara found that if she kept her sentences smooth and unhurried, her listeners matched her rhythm. Their breathing slowed. Their feet stopped scraping nervously. Calm, she realized, could be shared as easily as directions. The fog, too, seemed to respond, not by withdrawing, but by changing its manner. It became less like a wall and more like thick cloth, something one could move through if one accepted its pace. Clara guided the pair toward the next lamp, speaking continuously, not in a stream of chatter, but in gentle signposts. "There's the post now, just at your left," she said. "Now the curb. Take it slowly. Good. You're doing well." She was not flattering them. She was naming success as it happened, anchoring them in a sequence of small certainties. The pair thanked her and continued, their steps now quieter, their voices less pinched. Clara watched them fade, and she felt something settle in her chest, an understanding as tangible as the shawl on her shoulders. In a night like this, the city could not be conquered by sight. It had to be met by patience and by the steady thread of sound. Back at the lodging house, Edmund had brought the man into the entry far enough to stand beneath the lamp, but not so far that he seemed trapped by hospitality. The man explained again, more coherently now, where he had meant to go, and Edmund found his own thoughts aligning into a simple route. The fog would make it slow, but it was not impossible. Edmund did not offer grand assurances. He offered something better, an orderly plan. "If you step out again," he said, "go by the wall on your right until you reach the corner where the railings begin. You'll be able to feel them, even if you can't see them. Then turn left. Keep your pace steady. Don't try to hurry past the fog. It won't reward you for it." He paused, then added, as gently as he might set down a cup, "And if you lose the turn again, you may come back here. This door will be open." The man exhaled, a quiet sound that held more relief than words. He thanked Edmund, once, then again, as though gratitude too needed repetition to become real. When he stepped back into the fog, Edmund watched until the outline dissolved, and then he stood for a moment at the threshold, listening to the diminishing footsteps. The house behind him remained warm and steady, but the night outside felt newly inhabited, not by threat, but by need. Edmund closed the door with care and returned to his desk, yet he found he was no longer reading the ledger with his usual concentration. The fog had changed the meaning of the bell on his counter. It was not merely an instrument for guests, but a symbol of contact, of being found. He turned the lamp a fraction brighter, not glaring, only a touch more generous, and noticed how the light pooled on the floor like a small hearth. Outside, Clara continued along the market street, moving from lamp to lamp. She offered her voice once more to a man who had paused at a junction, then to a young errand boy holding a parcel too carefully, as if it might contain his own confidence. Each time, she discovered the same small miracle. If she spoke slowly and without judgment, the fog seemed to thin within the listener's mind, even if it remained thick in the air. People stopped treating the night as something to battle. They began instead to cooperate with it, measuring their steps, letting sound and touch guide them. By the time Clara reached a broader crossing, she noticed that the fog carried voices in unexpected ways. A phrase spoken a few paces away arrived at her ear as though from much farther, while a distant sound, a murmur, a cough, seemed suddenly near. Yet through all its strange rearrangements, one quality remained consistent. Calm speech held its shape. Excited words broke apart into the whiteness, but steady words traveled as complete things, like small lanterns carried by a careful hand. At the lodging house, another faint sound touched Edmund's attention. Not the bell this time, but footsteps outside, slow and searching. He did not yet move. He simply listened, allowing the rhythm to approach. There was no urgency in the pace, but there was hesitation, and Edmund recognized that particular pattern now, the pattern of someone measuring a world that refused to be measured by sight. He rose quietly from his chair and stepped toward the door before any knock came, as if to meet the night halfway. Across the market street, Clara paused again beneath a lamp whose glow seemed especially small, and she looked into the fog as if it were a page awaiting ink. Somewhere ahead, a voice called a name, not loudly, not desperately, but with gentle insistence, like someone trying not to disturb the evening. Clara felt her own voice ready in response, steady and sure, and in that readiness was a simple promise. Tonight, no one had to navigate London alone. The fog held its silence for a moment longer, and then the next question, made of footsteps and uncertainty, began to form, inviting Clara and Edmund alike to answer with the same patient light. The fog continued to behave like a patient artisan, laying down layer after layer until London's usual outlines felt stitched beneath a soft white cloth. In the lodging house, Edmund Hale kept the front lamp turned to a warm steadiness, neither harsh nor dim, and he found himself listening as much to the street as to the quiet interior behind him. The house held its familiar scent of polished wood and coal warmth, but the air at the doorway carried a cooler dampness, as if the night wished to be acknowledged each time the latch moved. When another set of footsteps approached, Measured, cautious, and oddly polite, Edmund did not wait for a knock. He opened the door with the same calm timing he used when welcoming a guest who had traveled far. A man stood just beyond the threshold, close enough that the lamplight brushed his cheek and the edge of his collar. His coat was neat but flecked with tiny beads of moisture, and he held a small parcel tucked under one arm with the careful protectiveness of someone who valued what he carried. His hat was in his hand, as if he had removed it out of courtesy to the house even before entering. "I beg your pardon," the man said, voice low and refined, yet threaded with a quiet strain. "I believe I've misplaced my way." Edmund's expression remained easy. "You're not the only one this evening," he replied, and the simple assurance softened the man's posture. Edmund invited him a step nearer the lamp, not as an instruction, but as a suggestion, and the man accepted it with relief. Up close, his face had the tidy patience of someone used to careful work, attentive eyes, ink-smudged fingertips, and the faint smell of glue and paper that clung to his cuffs. He introduced himself as Mr. Ashford, a bookbinder by trade, and explained that he had been delivering a repaired volume to a patron who lived not far, truly, except that tonight all distances had become unreliable. As Mr. Ashford spoke, Edmund noticed the way he apologized between sentences, as though the fog were a social misstep for which he ought to account. Edmund listened without interruption, then asked practical questions in a voice that made them feel like ordinary conversation rather than an interrogation. What had Mr. Ashford last recognized? Which direction had he heard the carts? Had he passed any particular shop, any railing or gate? Mr. Ashford admitted he had relied on sight and habit, and when those failed, he had kept walking, hoping the city would eventually explain itself. "It is a peculiar thing," he added, with a faint, embarrassed smile, "to discover that one's own feet do not always know best." "It isn't peculiar," Edmund said in a tone that made the statement feel true. "It's human." That seemed to settle Mr. Ashford. He exhaled softly, as though he had been holding his breath without noticing. Edmund could have given him directions and sent him on. The route was likely within reach. Yet the street outside had the muffled quality of a room with doors closed, and Edmund had begun to understand that this fog did more than blur corners. It altered confidence. It invited people to move too quickly out of discomfort, and speed only scattered their certainty further. Edmund glanced at the parcel under Mr. Ashford's arm. "If you don't mind waiting a moment," he said, "I'd like to find you a steadier way than guessing." Mr. Ashford's eyebrows lifted slightly, not in protest, but in curiosity. "Of course," he said, and his voice sounded grateful for permission to pause. A few streets away, Clara Wren had come to her own pause at a small junction where the market's busy familiarity gave way to quieter lanes. The fog held there in thick folds, as if it enjoyed gathering in places where choices had to be made. Clara stood beneath a gas lamp whose glow barely touched the next pool of light, and she listened with the attentive calm of someone reading a page by sound. Nearby, a young woman's footsteps approached in careful increments, stopping now and again as if the ground itself required negotiation. Clara could hear the faint rustle of fabric, the soft click of a small handbag clasped and unclasped, and a breath drawn in a measured pattern, steadying, counting, refusing to drift into fluster. Clara spoke first, gently, so the voice would be received rather than startled. "Good evening," she said. "Are you all right there?" The young woman halted, and for a moment her silence suggested she was deciding whether she had truly heard someone or only imagined it. Then she answered, voice quiet but composed. "I believe so," she said after a pause. "I'm simply uncertain of the turn." Clara stepped closer, just enough that the edge of lamplight reached the woman's sleeve. She saw a face that was young and earnest, framed by a modest bonnet, with eyes that did not dart about but held steady, as if searching for a sensible point to fix upon. The woman introduced herself as Miss Lottie Finch, a seamstress returning from delivering work. She carried a small bundle of folded cloth, wrapped to keep it dry, and held it with the same care Mr. Ashford had held his parcel, as though careful hands were the only proper response to an uncertain night. Clara recognized the quiet courage in the way Miss Finch stood. She was not panicked, only cautious, and there was a dignity in that. "The fog is behaving rather boldly tonight," Clara said, in a tone that made the remark almost affectionate. "May I walk a little with you until you find your marker again?" Miss Finch's shoulders loosened by the smallest degree. "If you wouldn't mind," she said. "I can usually tell where I am by the corner shop and the chimney pots, but I cannot see either now." "Then we'll use what we can," Clara replied. "We'll use sound, and we'll use the feel of the street, and we'll go slowly enough that nothing can surprise us." Clara began to move at a measured pace, and Miss Finch matched her without struggle, as if she had been waiting for permission to choose slowness. Clara described as they went: stone beneath their soles, the gentle slope where rainwater collected, the faint change in air where a narrow alley opened. She kept her sentences smooth and unhurried, allowing the words to arrive like warm hands placed lightly on the shoulder. Miss Finch listened closely, and soon she began to respond, adding her own observations with quiet precision. "There's a draft there," she noted as they passed a doorway, "and the cobbles have a wider gap near the curb." "Yes," Clara said, pleased. "That's exactly right. Keep noticing. The street is still here, even if it won't show its face." Back at the lodging house, Edmund considered what resources he had that were not merely directions. He could not see beyond a few paces, and he had no desire to send Mr. Ashford out alone to negotiate the fog's shifting distances. Yet Edmund knew the neighborhood by rhythm as much as by sight. He could recognize the approach of a cart by how the sound thickened near the corner, and he could tell where the public house stood by the occasional swell of laughter, softened tonight into a low hum. He also knew that when a person is lost, the simplest relief is company. He placed a small wooden stool near the desk for Mr. Ashford. "Sit, if you like," he said. "You look as if you've been holding yourself upright by will alone." Mr. Ashford smiled, faintly amused to be seen so accurately, and sat. The parcel remained in his lap, held gently, and his shoulders eased as though they had been waiting for an invitation to soften. Edmund poured a modest cup of water from the jug kept for guests and set it within reach. Then he returned to the door and opened it again, letting the fog's coolness touch the warm interior. He listened carefully. Footsteps moved somewhere nearby, then paused. Another set approached, lighter, quicker, then slowed. The fog carried a voice calling a name, gently, as though even the sound feared to lose itself. Edmund felt a quiet certainty. Tonight, the lodging house doorway was more than an entrance. It was a point of orientation. He stepped onto the threshold, not to patrol or to search, but to offer his presence as a stable mark in the white. He did not shout. He simply spoke into the fog with a calm steadiness, the way one might speak into a dim room to let someone know they were not alone. "If anyone is looking for their bearings," he said, "there is a light here." His words did not tear through the fog. They settled into it, forming a pocket of clarity by sound. A moment later, a figure appeared a little nearer, then paused, listening. Edmund could not see the face, but he could sense the shift in posture as the person oriented toward his voice. The figure moved closer, and then another, as if the first had signaled to someone behind. Meanwhile, Clara and Miss Finch continued their slow walk, and as they reached another lamp, Clara noticed a similar phenomenon. The fog seemed to gather people into small constellations around steady voices. A man stood uncertainly at the edge of the lamp's circle, head tilted as if listening for a landmark. Clara greeted him, and he replied with gratitude that sounded almost surprised. Miss Finch offered a small, reassuring comment of her own, and Clara saw her confidence brighten, not dramatically, but like a candle protected from a draft. It became clear in that quiet way truths sometimes become clear that the fog was not merely making people lost. It was making them available to one another. The usual London habit of hurrying past strangers, of keeping eyes forward and shoulders tight, did not fit this night. Here, people needed to speak, to check their pace, to confirm each other's presence with small courtesies. Clara found herself thinking of a procession, not a grand one with banners, but a gentle, practical one made of neighbors moving together simply because it helped. When Clara and Miss Finch neared the lodging-house street, the lamp in Edmund's entry cast a warmer glow than the streetlights, and the open doorway looked like a small harbor. Clara slowed, and Miss Finch slowed with her, their footsteps aligning naturally. They could hear Edmund's voice, calm and even, offering simple words that steadied the air. As they approached, Clara saw a man seated just inside, Mr. Ashford, his parcel in his lap, his face turned toward the doorway, as though listening to the world in a new way. Clara paused at the edge of the light. Edmund turned, and though the fog softened details, recognition arrived easily. Two calm presences meeting at a threshold often feel as though they have met before. "Good evening," Edmund said, and his voice carried the quiet hospitality of a place kept steady on purpose. Clara returned the greeting, and Miss Finch offered one as well, her tone modest but clear. In that warm pocket of lamplight, with fog pressing close but not entering fully, a small group formed without ceremony. A porter, a stallholder, a bookbinder, and a seamstress, gathered by chance and held together by calm. No one spoke of grand plans. They simply stood, listening to the city's softened sounds, and understood, each in their own gentle way, that moving through the night might be easier if they did it together. Edmund's gaze moved from one face to another, steady and practical. "If you're all willing," he said at last, "we can set out slowly, not to rush anywhere, only to help each other find the right turns." Clara's eyes warmed in agreement, and Miss Finch nodded, her fingers tightening briefly on her bundle as if to confirm her resolve. Mr. Ashford lifted his parcel slightly, as though it were a quiet pledge. Outside, the fog waited like a patient curtain. Inside the doorway, 4 voices had found one another, and in that simple meeting lay an invitation to become, for a little while, a small procession of steadiness moving through the white. They stepped out together, as if leaving a room where the lamp had been kind. Edmund went first, not with authority so much as with the habit of someone used to opening doors for others, and Clara followed at an easy distance that made the small group feel balanced. Mr. Ashford stayed near the middle, parcel held securely against his coat, and Miss Finch walked beside him, her bundle of cloth tucked close as though it were both work and reassurance. The fog met them at the threshold with a cool, damp touch, but it did not press or swirl. It simply waited around them, thick and pale, like a hush given shape. Edmund did not set a brisk pace. He chose a rhythm that could be shared without strain, a steady sequence of steps that allowed each footfall to register. "We'll take it slowly," he said, not as a warning, but as a plan. If we can hear each other, we can keep each other. His voice carried a warmth that seemed to hold together in the air rather than breaking apart. Clara felt it, and so did the others. Their breathing aligned in a quiet way, and the first few yards passed with the simple comfort of intention. In clearer weather, the street would have offered quick cues, shop signs, window light, the familiar pattern of cobblestones. Tonight, it offered texture instead. Clara noticed the small changes beneath her boots, where the stones were smoother from years of traffic, where they dipped slightly toward the gutter, where the surface roughened near a doorway. She began to name these things aloud, not in constant commentary, but in gentle markers that could be followed. "There's a slight slope here," she said, and waited until Miss Finch murmured agreement. "And the stones feel looser at the edge." In the fog, such details mattered. They became a kind of map drawn by sensation. Miss Finch, attentive by nature, added her own calm observations. "The air feels cooler on the left," she said softly. "There may be an alley there." Her voice was quiet but clear, and the group adjusted almost without discussion, drifting slightly right, so the unseen opening would remain at a safe distance. Mr. Ashford listened carefully, his steps measured, and each time he heard a cue, he repeated it under his breath as though binding it into memory. Edmund, meanwhile, kept his attention on the bigger rhythm of the street, the direction of sound, the shape of silence, the way the fog made distance behave strangely. They approached their first turning, a junction that in ordinary times would have been obvious from the widening of the pavement and the arrangement of lamp posts. Tonight, the widening felt like a subtle loosening beneath their feet, and the lamp itself looked less like a guiding star and more like a modest candle suspended in milk. Edmund raised a hand, not sharply, only enough to signal a pause, and the group stopped, not with tension, but with a shared understanding that stillness was part of the route. "Before we turn," Edmund said, "let's listen for a moment." His tone was calm enough to make listening feel natural rather than urgent. They stood in the fog, shoulders relaxed, and the world offered itself in pieces. A cartwheel creaked somewhere nearby, slow and patient, as though the driver had chosen caution over pride. A door closed with a soft finality. Somewhere farther off, a faint bell note arrived, rounded by the fog into something almost gentle. "There," Clara said quietly, not pointing but acknowledging. "The bell." Mr. Ashford tilted his head, and the faint line between his brows eased. "I hear it," he said, almost surprised by the certainty in his own voice. Edmund nodded. "It doesn't tell us everything," he replied, "but it tells us we're still within the city's comfort. We'll keep it in mind." Then, with simple clarity, he described the turn in words rather than gestures. "We'll go left here. Miss Finch, if you keep close enough to hear me, and Mr. Ashford, keep close enough to hear her, we won't drift apart." They turned as one, the movement smooth, like a slow dance learned without practice. Clara noticed how their pace made space for everyone's awareness. No one had to hurry to keep up, and no one had to push forward to prove their competence. The fog seemed to accept their rhythm, and the street, though hidden, revealed itself in small ways, through echoes, drafts, and the changing feel of the stones. A low rumble passed through the whiteness as a carriage moved at a careful crawl along a parallel road. Its presence was felt more than seen. The soft thud of hooves, the gentle rattle of harness, the faint scent of horse and damp leather. Miss Finch's eyes widened slightly at the sound, but she did not tense. Clara spoke in her steady shopkeeper's voice, the one that made choices seem easy. "It's only a carriage," she said, "slow as we are." The small reassurance carried across the group like a hand smoothing fabric, and Miss Finch's expression softened again. As they continued, Edmund began to cultivate small rituals, the kind that turn uncertainty into routine. When they approached a curb, he said so out loud. "Curb ahead," he'd murmur, and Clara would echo, "Curb." So the word reached Miss Finch and Mr. Ashford with the same steadiness. When they passed a wall close at their right, Clara would say, "Wall beside us," and Miss Finch would reach her fingertips out briefly, confirming the stone's cool solidity. The wall's texture, rough, slightly damp, was a comfort, an anchor that proved the world was still built of real things. Mr. Ashford, who at first had walked with an apologetic air, began to contribute in his own careful way. "The paving stones here are narrower," he observed after a few minutes, surprised by his own attention. "And there is a faint smell of smoke, coal, perhaps, from the right." Edmund acknowledged both details with quiet approval. "Good," he said. "Notice what you can. It is enough." In the fog's softened world, each small observation became a shared lantern, held aloft by calm voices. They passed a public house, though they did not see it clearly. They knew it by sound, a muted swell of conversation, laughter softened to warm murmurs, and the occasional clink of glass that sounded like a small bell in miniature. Warm air drifted toward them when the door opened briefly, carrying the scent of ale and roasted meat. The group did not stop, but the moment felt like passing a hearth in the street, and it lifted their spirits without requiring words. "You've walked this area often?" Mr. Ashford asked Edmund, his voice now less strained and more genuinely curious. "Most evenings," Edmund replied, his steps steady. "Not as far as the grand streets, but far enough to know how the stones feel when rain has settled." Clara added, "And I know the market roads as well as I know my shelves. Yet tonight I am learning them again. It is rather humbling." Miss Finch smiled faintly, the expression small but genuine. "Perhaps that is why it feels possible," she said. "Because no one is pretending it is easy." The simplicity of the remark warmed the space between them. The fog, for all its thickness, had created a kind of equality. Everyone was navigating by the same tools: sound, touch, calm speech, and so no one had to perform expertise. Their slow procession became not merely practical, but quietly companionable. At the next intersection, the fog thickened again, and the gas lamp's glow seemed to retreat into itself. Edmund paused, and the others stopped with him. The bell in the distance sounded again, faintly altered by the fog's shifting layers. Clara listened, then said, "It feels farther now, or the fog is holding it closer." Edmund replied, "Distance is behaving oddly. We'll not chase it. We'll simply keep our course." He spoke as if explaining a gentle rule of weather, and the calmness of his tone made the rule feel trustworthy. They moved on, following the right edge of the street, where a row of iron railings began, thin bars cold beneath Miss Finch's fingertips when she brushed them. The railings offered a straightness that the fog could not disguise, and the group stayed aligned by it, their footsteps falling into a shared cadence. Over time, that cadence became a kind of music. 4 sets of boots, meeting stone in measured agreement, separated by just enough space for each voice to carry. Clara realized as they walked that they were doing something rare for London. They were traveling in companionship without hurry, without suspicion, and without the need to impress. The fog had made the city intimate, turning strangers into neighbors simply because they could not see far enough to ignore one another. Even the way they spoke had changed, softer, slower, and more attentive to how words landed in the air. Their voices did not compete with the night. They joined it. As they rounded another gentle bend, the street seemed to narrow, and the fog took on a faint shimmer near the lamp ahead, as if the light were being filtered through fine cloth. Edmund slowed further, and the others matched him easily. "We're doing well," he said, not as praise but as a truthful report. "No one is rushing. No one is alone." Mr. Ashford adjusted his parcel, then said, "I had thought being lost would feel like failure. Instead, it feels..." He searched for the word, and Clara supplied it softly. "Different." "Yes," Mr. Ashford agreed, a small smile in his voice. "Different and oddly instructive." Miss Finch added, "It makes the smallest things matter. The sound of a bell, a railing, a voice that doesn't hurry." They walked a few more yards, and the fog, still thick, seemed less like an obstacle and more like a shared setting, an unusual night in which the city required gentler manners. Ahead, the faint outline of a long wall began to emerge, not fully visible, but hinted at by the way sound changed as they approached. Their footsteps echoed slightly differently, and their voices returned to them with a soft, close reflection. Edmund noticed it first, and lifted his hand again in that calm signal. "There's a wall ahead," he said. "Let's take it. It will guide us for a while." Clara, hearing the subtle promise in his words, felt a quiet lift of anticipation. A wall meant something solid to follow, a new kind of certainty, and perhaps, if the fog allowed, details to read with fingertips and voice. The group drifted toward the unseen stone, and as Clara reached out and touched it, cool and steady beneath her palm, she felt as though London itself had offered them an arm. "Here we are," she said softly, and in the warmth of their shared rhythm, the night seemed to invite them onward, slowly, together, and with the wall as their next gentle guide. The wall they had found was not grand, yet in the fog, it felt as reliable as a landmark carved into stone. Its surface was cool and faintly damp beneath Clara's palm, with patches where old paint had flaked away into delicate scales. When Edmund guided the group closer, the very air seemed to change. Their voices returned to them with a soft reflection, and their footsteps took on a slightly fuller sound, as if the wall were quietly acknowledging each step. They moved along it in a calm line, not pressed tightly together, but near enough that each person could hear the other's breathing and the gentle cadence of shoes on cobbles. Clara kept her hand lightly against the stone, not gripping, simply resting her fingertips where they could confirm the world. Miss Finch did the same after a moment, her touch careful and neat, as though she were testing fabric for quality. Mr. Ashford stayed just behind them, and Edmund walked slightly ahead, listening for changes in the street's shape. The fog continued to hold the city close, but with the wall beside them, it no longer felt like a blankness. It felt like a corridor, a passage with at least one sure edge, where, ahead and above, the bell sounded again. This time, it arrived with a little more clarity, a rounded note that seemed to carry a mild warmth in its own way, like a familiar voice heard through a closed door. The sound drifted through the fog and settled over the group, and for a moment, all four of them paused without needing to agree. The bell did not ring insistently. It rang once, then again after a patient interval, as if keeping time for the city rather than calling anyone in particular. Clara felt her shoulders ease. Something in that steady tone made the night feel organized, as though London still knew its own heart, even if its streets had gone shy. Mr. Ashford tilted his head. "It's strange," he murmured, "how a bell can feel nearer than a lamp." "Because it reaches us," Miss Finch said quietly. "Light seems to stop. Sound keeps traveling." Edmund nodded, pleased by the observation. "Sound is braver in fog," he said. or perhaps it is simply less bothered by not being seen. They resumed their pace along the wall, and the bell became a kind of companion. Not something to chase, but something to acknowledge. Edmund did not treat it like a compass needle to be followed sharply. He treated it as reassurance. Each time the note arrived, he noted its direction in his mind and measured it against the other sounds, the distant rumble of carts, the nearer hush of conversation behind closed doors, the occasional soft jingle of harness. The bell did not map the street precisely, but it confirmed they were still within a familiar circle of the city, still close to places where people lived and waited and kept their own lights turned low. Clara, who had always liked the practical magic of everyday things, began to think of the bell as a lantern made of sound. It did not illuminate the stones beneath their feet, but it lit something else, the sense of orientation that lived inside each person. The fog could hide buildings and signs, yet it could not hide that steady note. And as long as it rang, London felt less like a puzzle and more like a place with a patient pulse. They reached a point where the wall changed texture. Under Clara's hand, the stone gave way to a section layered with old posters and advertisements, their edges softened by moisture. The paper felt swollen and delicate, like damp leaves pressed to the surface. Clara traced a line of raised print and smiled faintly. "There are notices here," she said. "Old ones by the feel of them." Mr. Ashford leaned closer, his interest drawn as naturally as a needle to thread. "May I?" he asked, and when Clara shifted slightly, he reached out and let his fingertips read the wall with careful expertise. "Printed letters," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "Some of these are quite fine, and some—" He found a corner where paper had curled and lifted. "Some have been here long enough to become part of the stone." Miss Finch listened, amused by his quiet delight. "It must feel familiar," she said. "It does," Mr. Ashford replied. "Not the content perhaps, but the texture of time." Edmund let them linger for a moment, then guided them onward with the gentle authority of someone tending a steady pace. The fog had taught them the value of pauses, but it had also taught them that moving, however slowly, was its own kind of reassurance. They continued along the wall, their procession unbroken, their voices low and even. When the bell sounded again, Clara found herself smiling into the whiteness, as though the sound had become a friendly acquaintance. After a few minutes, the street widened, and the wall's presence began to slip away. The group felt the change immediately. Their footsteps grew quieter again, and the soft reflection of their voices diminished. Clara's hand fell naturally to her side, and Miss Finch's fingertips left the stone with a small reluctance, as though releasing a handrail. The fog thickened slightly in the open space, and the next lamp's glow looked smaller, as if it were floating at a distance. Edmund slowed. "We've reached a broader crossing," he said. "This is where people often lose their sense of turn." Mr. Ashford's parcel shifted under his arm, and he drew it closer. "That was exactly my trouble," he admitted. "Everything felt repeated." "That is the fog's trick," Clara said. "It smooths the differences." "Then we won't ask it for differences," Edmund replied. "We'll ask it for what it cannot hide." He gestured slightly, though gesture was more habit than usefulness now, and then he added, "Listen again." They stood together, and the city offered its subtle cues. There was a faint draft that suggested an alley to the right. A softer echo suggested a row of buildings close on the left. Somewhere ahead, a cart creaked, and the sound seemed to pass slowly across their awareness like a boat moving behind reeds. And then the bell rang again, its tone steady and rounded, arriving with that peculiar fog-altered quality that made distance feel like a gentle suggestion rather than a fixed fact. Miss Finch spoke first this time, her voice calm and measured. "It sounds a little to our left," she said. "Not directly ahead." Mr. Ashford nodded, surprised to find himself contributing. "And the carts," he added, "seem nearer on the right, as if there is a main road there." Clara considered the air on her cheek. "The draft is cooler on the right," she said. An opening. Edmund absorbed their observations, and Clara could almost hear the way his mind fitted them together, like pieces of a quiet puzzle. "Good," he said at last. "We'll keep left enough to remain near the buildings, but not so close that we lose the crossing. We'll move toward the bell's general direction, but we won't chase it. If the bell wanders in the fog, we will not wander with it." They began again, and the act of moving felt simpler now, not because the fog had thinned, but because the group had learned a method. They did not demand certainty all at once. They built it step by step, sound by sound, word by word. Clara found herself speaking less in instructions and more in shared noticing, as though her voice were part of the environment. "The stones are smoother here," she said, and Miss Finch replied, "Yes, worn by many feet." Mr. Ashford added, "Then we are near a busier lane." Edmund acknowledged with a soft hum of agreement. As they progressed, they passed other figures moving through the whiteness, shapes that approached and then drifted away. Some were solitary, walking with cautious pauses. Some were paired, voices murmuring close. Once, a man's voice called softly for someone named Elsie, and another voice answered, near enough that the relief in it was audible. The fog seemed to gather such exchanges and hold them gently, as if it approved of people finding one another by sound. The bell rang again, and this time Clara noticed something. The note seemed to arrive with a faint, trembling softness at its edge, as though the fog were wrapping it in velvet. The sound did not weaken. It changed texture, becoming even more comforting. Clara glanced at Edmund. "It feels as though the bell is being careful with us," she said quietly. Edmund's mouth curved in a small, thoughtful smile. "Or perhaps," he replied, "we are learning to hear it properly." They reached another stretch of buildings, close enough now that the faint outlines of windows and doorframes began to suggest themselves. The fog remained, but it was not impenetrable. It was simply selective, offering glimpses rather than views. Mr. Ashford's shoulders had lowered, his breath steady, his parcel held with less tension. Miss Finch walked with her head level, eyes soft, as though she were no longer searching frantically for proof of place. Clara's steps felt confident, not because she could see, but because she knew how to proceed without seeing. And Edmund, steady at the front, seemed less like a guide and more like a keeper of pace, ensuring the night did not hurry anyone into confusion. When the bell sounded once more, Edmund slowed and looked back at them, checking each face in the lamp's faint glow. "We'll soon reach a point where the streets narrow again," he said. "There is a long wall there, with more notices than stone, and it will offer us an easy edge to follow. We can use it to reach the next familiar bend." Clara's interest stirred. "A wall like the last one?" "Similar," Edmund replied, "though I recall it has more paint and paper than sense. Still, it holds steady." Mr. Ashford's eyes brightened at the mention of notices. Miss Finch's expression softened with relief at the idea of another reliable boundary. The bell, behind them now or beside them, distance uncertain, seemed to approve with its next gentle note. And as the group moved forward in their measured rhythm, the fog ahead took on a faint suggestion of texture, as though a long surface awaited their hands. The bell's steady presence remained in the air like a promise, and the city, though hidden, began to feel increasingly readable. One calm observation at a time, The next wall announced itself before it could be clearly seen, not by height or grandeur, but by the way the world changed as they approached. The bell's note, still patient somewhere in the fog, took on a closer echo, and their own footsteps began to sound fuller, as though the stones had decided to answer them. A faint, papery scent drifted through the cool air, wet paste, old ink, and the soft must of layered notices that had weathered more than one season. Clara reached out first, as she had before, and her palm met a surface that felt less like bare stone and more like a collage of time. Under her fingertips, paper had been pressed and pressed again, edges overlapping in a thick quilt. Some sections were rough with dried glue, others slick where paint had been brushed over old announcements without bothering to remove them. The wall was cool and steady beneath it all, a patient backbone holding the city's forgotten messages. Clara's hand moved slowly along it, and her fingers found raised letters here and there, softened by dampness but still readable in texture. "There are layers," she said, voice warm with quiet fascination. "It feels like the wall is wearing a coat made of old words." Mr. Ashford leaned nearer at once, drawn as if the wall had called him by trade. He did not press his face close. Fog and courtesy both prevented that, but he brought his fingers up with careful respect and began to read the surface the way he might read a title page. "Here," he murmured, "is a bold hand, and here, smaller type. Possibly a notice for a performance." His voice softened as he worked, the concentration in it almost musical. The ink would have been black once. The paper, perhaps cream. Now everything is the color of damp air. Miss Finch listened with the attentive calm of someone accustomed to detail, and when she placed her own fingertips on the wall, she did so gently, as though she were testing a fine cloth. "The edges are frayed," she observed, "like a hem that has been let out and stitched again." Edmund stood slightly ahead, keeping their procession aligned, and smiled faintly at how naturally the wall had become a point of shared interest rather than merely a guide. "We can follow this for a while," he said. "It runs long, and it does not change its mind the way the fog does." He spoke as if the wall were an acquaintance with a dependable temperament. They resumed their slow movement, the wall on their right, their voices low enough to feel private and clear enough to remain useful. The fog pressed close, but with the wall's steady presence, the street felt less like a blank expanse and more like a corridor with one firm edge. Clara found herself speaking in the same rhythm she used when arranging her stall, orderly, gentle, unhurried. "A seam of paint here," she noted. "It's smoother. And, raised letters again." Each observation was like placing a small stone in a line, creating a path that others could follow. As they walked, Clara began to read the fragments she could make out by touch, not as a formal recitation, but as a soft pastime that warmed the air. "To let," she said, fingertips tracing the beginning of a phrase. "Rooms." She paused, and then laughed quietly, not at the notice, but at the absurdity of reading it this way. "Imagine taking a room on the strength of my fingertips," Mr. Ashford replied, his tone amused and fond. "If your fingertips approve, I would consider it a strong recommendation." Miss Finch's smile could be heard in her voice when she added, "Perhaps the wall chooses tenants by gentleness." Their light humor did not break the calm. It deepened it, the way a small candle flame steadies in a sheltered corner. The fog seemed to listen, holding their words without smudging them. Even Edmund, who was usually sparing with remarks, found himself adding an observation now and then about the way sound tightened near the wall, or how the cobblestones underfoot felt more even in this stretch, as if the street had been better cared for. At one point, the wall offered a patch where paint had been applied thickly over paper. creating a smooth plane that felt almost like polished plaster. Clara slid her hand across it and felt an unexpected warmth, not from the wall itself, but from the way the paint held the day's lingering heat. "This part is warmer," she said softly, as if the wall remembered sunlight. Miss Finch paused to confirm it with her own touch. "Yes," she agreed. "Just a little, like a warmed teacup." Mr. Ashford, who had been reading a different section, lifted his hand and found the warm patch too. "Remarkable," he murmured, and in his voice was the quiet delight of a man who loved small proofs that the world remained tangible. They continued, and the wall's coat of old words began to feel like a story unfolding in pieces. Clara traced the outline of a large poster and found, by touch alone, the impression of decorative borders, swirls and flourishes that must once have been crisp. "This one was proud," she said, smiling. Whatever it announced, it wanted to be noticed. Edmund kept their pace steady while allowing the wall's details to occupy their attention. He understood, with his practical porter's sense, that fascination could be as useful as fear was harmful. If they were engaged, if their minds were gently anchored, the fog had less room to unsettle them. Their voices, calm and interested, became a kind of lantern light in sound, steady, warm, and shared. The street curved slightly, and as they followed the wall around the bend, the bell's note arrived again, faint but consistent. It was more distant now, or perhaps simply filtered differently by the changing shape of buildings. Still, it remained a reassuring pulse, and the group moved as if they were walking alongside that invisible rhythm. Clara noticed that whenever the bell rang, her own voice softened, as though responding instinctively to something steady and ceremonial. They passed other walkers along the wall, shapes that drifted into the edge of their lamplight and then away again. A man paused near them, hand outstretched to find the wall, and Clara spoke gently to let him know he was not alone. "The wall is here," she said. "You're close enough now." The man thanked her in a quiet voice and fell into step for a short distance before choosing a turn of his own. No one made a fuss of it. The fog had introduced strangers and then allowed them to separate again with the same soft courtesy. Mr. Ashford, still amused by the wall's layered notices, grew more reflective as they walked. "It occurs to me," he said after a time, "that I spend my days binding pages so they will not scatter. Yet tonight, it is the city that has scattered, and we are binding it again, by sound and touch." Clara considered that, her hand still steady on the wall. "Perhaps that is what we do whenever we help one another," she replied. "We gather what feels loose. We make it hold." Miss Finch added quietly, "And we do it without pulling too tightly." The simplicity of her words sat warmly among them. Edmund, listening ahead for changes in the street, felt a quiet satisfaction that this small group, formed by fog and chance, had already learned a shared skill. Their pace was not merely slow, it was intentional, a rhythm that invited clarity rather than chasing it. Then the wall surprised them. Clara's hand, moving along the familiar patchwork of paper and paint, suddenly met a section that was different, carved, not covered. The surface shifted under her fingers from layered paper to something recessed and cool, the edges sharply defined. She stopped instinctively, and the others stopped with her, their procession pausing as one body. "What is it?" Edmund asked, his voice steady. "There's an inset," Clara said softly, tracing the shape, "like a small niche, or a plaque that has been cleared." Mr. Ashford stepped closer, careful not to crowd. He reached out, and his fingertips found the same shape. "A stone plaque," he murmured. "The paper has been scraped away around it." He traced the letters slowly, reading by touch. "It says, St. Bartholomew's. He paused, concentrating, then continued. This way. Miss Finch's breath left her in a small sound of relief. A direction, she said. An honest one. Edmund's posture eased, not because a church name solved their whole route, but because it offered a fixed point in a night of softened edges. We know where we are then, he said, or near enough to know our next turn. Clara kept her hand on the plaque a moment longer, feeling the certainty of carved letters. In the fog, this small discovery felt like finding a familiar line in a book when the rest of the page had blurred. She looked toward the whiteness ahead, where the wall continued and the street curved onward, and she felt a quiet sense of invitation. Shall we follow it? She asked, not urgently, simply offering the idea as one offers a warm cup across a counter. Edmund nodded, and his voice carried the same steady warmth as the lodging house lamp. Yes, he said. We'll follow it, slowly, and see what else the city is willing to tell us. The plaque's carved certainty lingered with them as they moved on, as though the letters, patiently cut into stone long before this strange fog had ever been imagined, had lent their steadiness to the air. Edmund kept the wall to their right for a few more yards, letting the group remain aligned by touch, while the street gently changed beneath their feet. Somewhere beyond the next bend, the bell continued its calm intervals, and though it no longer felt like a compass to be obeyed, it remained a friendly assurance that the city still held its own rhythm. They left the painted wall at a point where the pavement narrowed, and the fog thickened again as if it preferred such small passages. Here, the gas lamps seemed especially modest, their halos close and quiet. Edmund slowed by instinct, and the others matched him without discussion. Clara noticed how natural the procession felt now, not merely 4 people walking together, but 4 people sharing a method, pausing, listening, speaking with care. Miss Finch's steps were unhurried and sure, her bundle held close but no longer clutched. Mr. Ashford carried his parcel with the calm protectiveness of someone who had decided it was safe to be careful rather than anxious. Ahead, a soft metallic tap reached them, rhythmic and deliberate, like a gentle metronome. It was followed by the faint scrape of a pole against iron, and then by a small, controlled flare of sound, an almost whispered hiss. The fog shifted, and a little bloom of warm light appeared, briefly brighter than the usual lamps, as if someone had coaxed a flame into fuller life. Edmund lifted his hand and brought the group to a quiet stop. Someone's working, he murmured. Out of the whiteness stepped a man with a long pole balanced lightly against his shoulder, his movements calm and practiced. He wore a dark coat buttoned neatly and a cap pulled low to keep damp from his brow. In the fog's muted glow, his face was not sharply defined, yet his presence was unmistakable, purposeful, steady, and oddly reassuring. He reached up with the pole and adjusted the nearest lamp, and the light responded by gathering itself, brightening into a warmer circle that seemed, for a moment, to push the fog back an extra pace. The man lowered the pole and looked toward the small group, as if he had sensed them by sound before sight. "Evening," he said, voice low and even, and his tone had the calm authority of someone who knew the streets by duty rather than by habit. "Good evening," Edmund replied. "You're a welcome sight even through fog." The lamplighter gave a faint smile. "That's kind of you. Though I expect, tonight, I'm more welcome as a voice than as a sight." His gaze moved from Edmund to Clara, then to Mr. Ashford and Miss Finch, taking them in without scrutiny. "You're moving carefully. That's the right way of it." Clara felt an immediate respect for him. There was nothing hurried in his manner, no bravado about battling the fog. He treated it as a condition to work within, like rain or wind. "It's thicker than usual," she said. "Thicker," the lamplighter agreed, "and sly about it. It steals your distances and gives them back in the wrong order." He tapped the pole lightly on the ground, a small sound that seemed to settle the space. "Name's Silas Kemp. I've been tending these lamps long enough to know when the city's in a peculiar mood." Mr. Ashford, whose curiosity had been quietly building since the beginning of their walk, asked, "Does it happen often? A fog like this?" Silas considered, then answered in a tone that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "Not often," he said, "but there are nights when London behaves like a dreaming thing. It's still itself, same bones, same stones, only the edges soften, and what you think you know gets rearranged. The trick is not to argue with it." Miss Finch listened with attentive calm, and when Silas spoke of a dreaming city, she did not look unsettled. She looked thoughtful, as though the idea matched something she had felt, but not named. "So we must be gentle with it," she said. Silas's smile deepened slightly. "Exactly so. Gentle and patient." He lifted his chin toward the fog. "Most folk try to walk faster when they can't see, as if speed will outrun uncertainty. But the fog enjoys that. It lets them spin themselves into confusion." He paused, then added with a mild humor, "Fog is like a cat. If you chase it, it goes where it pleases." Clara's quiet laugh warmed the air. Edmund's mouth curved in agreement, and even Mr. Ashford looked pleased by the comparison. "Then we'll do as cats prefer," Edmund said. "We'll let it come to us at its own pace." Silas nodded. "A sensible plan." He glanced up at the lamp he had just adjusted. "I'll be walking this stretch for a while. If you're headed towards St. Bartholomew's, you're not far from one of my rounds." He shifted the pole to his other hand and added, "You're welcome to keep near me until the next corner. Lamps are easier to find when you listen for the pole." Edmund accepted the offer without ceremony. "We'd be glad of the company," he said, and his voice carried a quiet gratitude. The group resumed their slow procession, now with Silas walking slightly ahead, his pole tapping lightly at intervals. The sound was steady and distinct, and Clara found that it worked like the bell in miniature, an audible anchor that did not depend on sight. As they moved, Silas shared small practical wisdom in the same calm tone he used for his work. "Sound slips in fog," he said. "If you hear wheels, don't assume they're right in front. They might be a street over. And corners. Corners are tricky. They swallow footsteps." He demonstrated by pausing before the next bend, letting his pole touch the ground once. "Before you turn, stop. Let the street tell you if it's busy. A cart will announce itself in time if you give it space to speak." Clara watched his movements with quiet admiration. He was not dramatic. He was simply precise. Each pause had purpose. Each step carried the assurance of someone who had learned to cooperate with London's moods, rather than force them. The fog, thick as it was, seemed almost respectful around him, as if it had met him many nights and had decided not to interfere too much. Mr. Ashford, walking close enough to hear, asked, "Do you ever feel lonely, tending lamps in weather like this?" Silas considered that question for longer than the others expected, not because it troubled him, but because it deserved a truthful answer. "Sometimes," he said at last, "but not in the way people imagine. Loneliness isn't always being alone. It's being unheard." He tapped the pole lightly again, and the sound rang softly. "Tonight, folk are listening. They're speaking to one another. It's a good night for a man who works by keeping little circles of light alive." Miss Finch's voice was gentle when she replied, "Then perhaps your work does more than you realize." Silas's expression softened. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps I'm simply fortunate to be part of the city's quiet machinery." They passed another lamp, and Silas adjusted it with a practiced lift of the pole. The flame brightened, and the fog's whiteness took on a warmer tint for a few steps. Clara noticed that in the improved light, the outlines of doorways appeared more clearly, and the street's textures became easier to read. Yet the comfort did not come from visibility alone. It came from the shared steadiness of their small procession, voices, footsteps, and the gentle tap of the lamplighter's pole. As they neared the next corner, Silas slowed and raised a hand, mirroring Edmund's earlier habit. "Here's where sound likes to play tricks," he said. "Stand a moment, listen for the hollow. If you hear your own voice, come back quickly. The wall is close. If it takes longer, there's space, a side lane perhaps." Clara spoke softly, testing it without thinking. "Good evening," she said, letting the words float out. The fog carried them, and the sound returned quickly, a soft echo that suggested a building close by. "Close wall," she observed, pleased. Silas nodded. "Good ear." He looked toward Edmund. "You've done well keeping them calm. That's the best lantern of all." Edmund's reply was modest. "It helps when the others lend their light too." At the corner, Silas turned his head slightly, as if listening to a route only he could hear. "I must go that way," he said, gesturing into the whiteness with the tip of his pole. "There are 3 lamps along the next stretch that need minding." Clara felt a small reluctance at the thought of parting from him, as one might feel reluctant to leave a warm shop after stepping in from cold air. "Thank you, Mr. Kemp," she said. "Your advice has made the fog feel manageable." Silas gave a quiet, respectful nod. "Keep your pace," he said. "Keep your voices steady. And if the city starts behaving like a dream, remember, dreams don't like to be chased. They like to be listened to." His eyes moved to Miss Finch and Mr. Ashford. "You'll be all right. You've already learned the most important part." With that, he stepped away, his figure receding into the fog until only the faint tap of his pole remained. Then even that softened and disappeared. The group stood for a moment in the warmer pool of the lamp he had just adjusted, letting his presence settle into memory like a well-told tale. Edmund turned back to the others, and his voice was steady as ever. "We'll continue," he said. "We're not far from another reliable edge, iron railings, if I recall correctly. We'll follow them until we reach the next bend." Clara nodded, feeling the quiet confidence that comes from good guidance received and understood. Miss Finch adjusted her bundle with calm hands. Mr. Ashford shifted his parcel and smiled faintly, as though he had been reminded that the city contained people whose work was simply to keep things gently in order. They moved on, their procession intact, and as they walked, the fog seemed a little less like a blankness and more like a soft stage on which careful voices could shape the scene. Somewhere ahead, the bell sounded again, faint, steady, patient, and Clara felt as though it were answering Silas's parting words, inviting them to keep listening, one calm step at a time. Silas Kemp's presence lingered in the air even after the sound of his pole had softened into the fog, as if the lamplighter had left behind a steady way of listening. Edmund led the procession onward with the same unhurried certainty, and Clara walked beside him for a few steps, allowing their pace to settle back into the rhythm they had made together. Mr. Ashford and Miss Finch followed close, neither crowding nor drifting, their footsteps quiet on the damp cobbles. The bell sounded faintly somewhere beyond, a rounded note that seemed to arrive through layers of cloth, and each time it came, it felt less like a direction and more like a calm reminder that London still had a pulse. The fog thickened and thinned in small waves, as though it breathed with the city. At times, it swallowed the nearest lamp's halo into a tight little circle. At others, it allowed the faint suggestion of a doorway or railing to appear, just long enough to be acknowledged. The air smelled of wet stone and coal smoke softened by moisture, and now and again a faint warmth drifted from behind curtained windows, carrying hints of supper and laundry drying near a hearth. Those ordinary scents moved through the fog like messages, small assurances that life continued behind the whiteness. They came to a stretch where Edmund expected iron railings, but instead found a street that felt newly unfamiliar underfoot. It was not that the stones were different, only that the fog had blurred the subtle landmarks that usually helped him place a route. The bell's note seemed to shift as well, now nearer, now farther, as if the sound were being gently turned in the air. Edmund slowed and paused, and the others stopped with him without unease, as though pauses had become part of their shared language. "We may have drifted slightly," Edmund said, not apologetically, but with the calm honesty of a man reading the weather. "Not far. Just enough that the familiar edge isn't where I expected." Clara listened to the space around them. "The street feels broader," she observed, "and the air is warmer in front." Miss Finch added, "There's a scent, tea, I think, or something steeped." Mr. Ashford, always attentive to subtlety, tilted his head. "And a small clink," he said, as if a spoon touched a cup. The group stood still, and in that stillness, the fog seemed less like a barrier and more like a curtain that could be parted by patience. Ahead, in the near distance, a thin seam of light appeared, narrow, steady, and warmer in tone than the gas lamps. It did not spread into a circle. It remained a line, as if it came from a door left slightly ajar. The glow fell across the pavement in a slim ribbon, and within it, the wet stones looked almost golden. Clara felt a gentle lift in her chest. "A shop," she said softly. "Someone has left their door open." Edmund nodded, and his voice carried the quiet practicality that had guided them since the first threshold. "We'll take that warmth," he said, "not as a rescue, only as a courteous pause." He moved forward at the same careful pace, and the others followed, their footsteps aligning with his. As they approached, the scent grew clearer. Black tea, faintly floral, and something sweet. Perhaps bread warmed earlier, perhaps a small cake kept under cloth. The warmth itself was subtle but unmistakable, drifting out in gentle puffs each time the door shifted. The shop front emerged in pieces, a window whose glass was fogged from inside, a small painted sign above, and a lantern hanging near the door that glowed with a softer, steadier flame than the street lamps. The sign's lettering was difficult to read through mist, but the shape of it suggested a tea shop or small cafe, the kind that served laborers and clerks alike without ceremony. The door was indeed ajar, no wider than a handspan. Edmund paused before it, not wishing to intrude. Then, in his calm porter's voice, he called gently into the warmth. "Good evening. Forgive us. We're passing carefully. Might we step in for a moment?" For a heartbeat, there was only the soft hiss of a kettle somewhere within, and then a voice answered, an older woman's voice, steady and unruffled. "You may," she said simply. "Come in and bring the fog with you, only as far as the mat." Edmund smiled at that and opened the door wider, and the group stepped into a small room that felt like a pocket of summer tucked into the damp night. The air was warm and smelled of tea leaves and polished wood. A few tables stood close together, their surfaces wiped clean, and a small counter held a tin of biscuits and a row of cups turned upside down to dry. The lamps inside were low and kind, casting a golden light that made everyone's faces seem softer, as if the fog's gentleness had followed them in and taken on a warmer color. Behind the counter stood the proprietor, Mrs. Ellery, a woman with silvering hair tucked neatly back and sleeves rolled to her forearms as if she had been working steadily all evening. She looked at them with the composed interest of someone used to late customers and unexpected weather. "You've brought yourselves in quietly," she observed, and there was a hint of approval in her tone. "We've learned to," Clara replied. She felt her shoulders loosen as warmth settled into her shawl. "The streets are behaving strangely." Mrs. Ellery nodded, as though the street's behavior were merely another item on the day's list. "They are," she agreed. "Fog like this makes people either hurry or hold still. I prefer the ones who hold still." She gestured toward a table near the wall. "Sit a moment. Tea costs a penny, but calm is free." They took the offered seats, and the simple act of sitting felt like closing a door on uncertainty, not to lock it out, but to let it rest at the threshold. Mr. Ashford placed his parcel carefully on his lap rather than the table, still protective, yet his hands no longer trembled with effort. Miss Finch set her bundle down beside her chair and unwrapped the top cloth slightly, checking that it remained dry. Clara rubbed her palms together and felt the warmth return to her fingers. Edmund, ever mindful, remained half standing for a moment, looking around as if to ensure the space was safe and pleasant for the others before allowing himself to settle. Mrs. Ellery poured tea with a steady hand, the liquid dark and steaming, and set the cups down one by one. The clink of porcelain was small and bright, a sound that seemed to cut cleanly through the fog's softness. "There," she said. "Now, tell me, where are you all meant to be?" The question was asked without pressure, as if it were a gentle conversation starter rather than an inquiry. Yet, as soon as it was posed, something subtle shifted in the group. The destinations they had avoided naming too firmly, perhaps out of superstition, perhaps out of embarrassment, suddenly felt speakable. Miss Finch was the first to answer, her voice modest. "I'm meant to be near Aldersgate," she said, "in a small room above a cobbler's shop. I can usually find it by the sound of his hammer, but the fog has rearranged sound." Mrs. Ellery nodded. "It does," she said, as if the fog were a mischievous child. Mr. Ashford spoke next, his tone careful but less apologetic than before. "I'm meant to deliver this to a patron near Smithfield," he said, tapping the parcel lightly. "It's a repaired volume. I know the streets well enough in ordinary weather, but tonight, every corner has felt alike." Clara smiled gently. "I'm meant to go only as far as my rooms behind the market," she admitted. "Yet I've walked those streets so often that I didn't realize how much I relied on sight until it was taken away." All eyes turned, then, to Edmund, as if his role as porter made him naturally the most placed of them all. Edmund sipped his tea, then said simply, "I meant to keep my lodging house steady. Tonight, that steadiness seems to extend a little farther than the front desk." The warmth of the tea did more than heat their hands. It loosened the tightness of self-consciousness. They began to speak of street names as if reciting familiar verses. Corners where a particular railing began, a shop with a striped awning, a narrow lane that smelled of baking when the wind was kind. As they spoke, the city reassembled itself in their minds, not by sight, but by memory and sound and shared description. Mrs. Ellery listened with quiet interest, occasionally offering a practical comment. "If you aim for the church bell," she said at one point, "don't aim too sharply. Fog bends sound like it bends light. Better to keep to the edges you can touch." Clara felt, in that moment, how the telling itself was a kind of guidance. Naming their intended places did not magically clear the streets, but it restored a sense of purpose that the fog had softened. It also restored dignity. Being lost was no longer a private failing. It was a condition shared, spoken of plainly over warm cups. After a few minutes, Edmund set his cup down and glanced toward the door, where the fog still waited beyond the mat. "We should go on," he said gently. "Not because we must hurry, but because moving while we are warm will keep our pace steady." Mrs. Ellery rose and moved to the door with them, as if to see them off like familiar customers. "Take the warmth with you," she said, and though her words were practical, they carried a quiet kindness. "And if you find yourselves circling back, you know where the seam of light is." Clara smiled at that image, the seam of light, because it felt exactly right. Edmund thanked Mrs. Ellery. Miss Finch offered her a quiet, sincere nod, and Mr. Ashford murmured gratitude with the careful politeness of a man who respected a well-run establishment. Then they stepped back into the fog, and the cool dampness met them again, though now it felt less intrusive. Warmth clung to their sleeves and lingered in their breath. Outside, the seam of light narrowed as the door eased almost shut behind them, but it did not disappear. It remained like a small promise in the mist. The group reformed their slow procession, voices calm, senses renewed, and as they took their first steps away, the bell sounded again, faint and rounded, as if acknowledging their pause. Clara glanced back once at the thin line of warmth, then forward into the white. "If we keep speaking like this," she said softly, "it feels as though the city will answer." Edmund's reply was quiet, confident, and inviting. "Then let's continue," he said, "and let's see what else the night is willing to show us, one gentle marker at a time." The warmth from Mrs. Ellery's tea shop lingered on their hands and in the folds of their coats as they returned to the fog, and that lingering warmth seemed to steady their pace even more than the lamps could. The seam of light behind them narrowed to a fine line and then was swallowed by whiteness, yet its presence remained in their minds like an address spoken clearly and remembered. Edmund led with quiet certainty, not because the street had become easier to see, but because they had become easier within themselves. Clara walked near him, her attention tuned to subtle changes in air and texture, and behind them, Mr. Ashford and Miss Finch kept close enough that the soft cadence of their footsteps became one shared rhythm. The fog had not thinned. If anything, it felt heavier now, as though the night had fully committed to its pale covering. Still, the group moved through it with a different relationship. They no longer treated it as something to resist. They treated it as a condition to navigate with courtesy, like a narrow hallway where one must mind one's shoulders. Each time the bell sounded, faint and rounded, it reassured them that the city's pulse continued somewhere beyond what they could see. After several measured turns, chosen carefully, confirmed by touch and sound, the air began to change. It grew cooler and carried a dampness that felt broader than ordinary street moisture, as if the night had opened into a wider space. The smell was different too. Less coal and cooking, more water and algae and old wood. Clara noticed it first and spoke calmly, as if naming it would make it useful. "The air is changing," she said. "We're near water." Edmund nodded, already listening. The city's muffled sounds shifted as well. Footsteps echoed less sharply, as if the ground were more open, and somewhere nearby a rope creaked against a post in a slow, patient rhythm. A low groan followed, a wooden complaint, gentle and familiar, and then a soft lap-lap against stone. The sound was not dramatic. It was steady, quiet, and persistent, as if the river were breathing. "The Thames," Mr. Ashford murmured, and the way he said it carried respect rather than romance. He had lived in London long enough to know that the river was both practical and powerful, a working presence that shaped the city's habits. Tonight, in the fog, it felt like an even stronger landmark than the bell. Water did not move its position, because the fog wished it to. The river's presence could be heard and felt, and that made it trustworthy. Edmund slowed, bringing the group to a careful pause. "We'll use it," he said, "not to follow it too closely, but to understand where we are." He turned slightly, as though orienting his shoulders toward the sound. "Listen to the river's breathing. It will tell us which way the open space lies." They stood and listened, allowing stillness to sharpen their hearing. The river's lap against stone came in slow intervals, and between the sounds, there was a hush that felt larger than any street's hush. It was not empty. It was spacious. Clara could almost feel that spaciousness on her face, the way the air moved more freely near open water. Somewhere to their left, a boat shifted gently, its timbers creaking as if settling into a comfortable position. A chain clinked softly. A distant call, perhaps a dock worker checking for a companion, rose and fell in the fog like a line of music. Miss Finch spoke after a moment, her voice calm and precise. "The water sounds slightly left," she said, "and the air is colder there, so the river is that way." "Yes," Edmund agreed, "and if the river is left, then the streets that lead inland will be right." He turned his head toward Clara. "If we keep the river as a reference, we won't lose our sense of direction, even when the bell seems to wander." Clara liked the thought. It felt simple, practical, and oddly comforting. The city's breath beside them, steady and unbothered by fog. She began to describe what she heard in gentle phrases, the way she had learned to do since the night began. "The lap is soft," she said. "Not a wave, only the edge touching stone. And the creak, wood against rope, like a slow rocking chair." Mr. Ashford's voice warmed with quiet appreciation. "It's a sound that suggests patience," he said. "The river has no need to hurry." Miss Finch nodded, her bonnet's outline barely visible in the lamp's faint reach. "Then we should match it," she said. They moved again, this time with a new method. Not only the wall, the railings, the bell, but the river's breathing as an anchor in the soundscape. Edmund guided them along a path that kept them near enough to benefit from the river's orientation, but not so near that they risked stepping into unseen edges or open drops. The embankment's stones were cool and slightly slick, and Edmund warned them gently whenever the ground sloped. "Careful here," he said, and Clara repeated, "Careful." So the word traveled down the line. As they walked, the fog took on a different character near the Thames. It seemed to glow faintly, not from its own light, but from the way it caught and scattered every small illumination. A lamp on a post, a lantern on a boat, a window far across the water. These lights were dim and distant, yet in the fog they became soft beads, suspended as if in a dream. Clara felt the scene settle around them like a quiet theater, and their voices became part of the set, steady, warm, and essential. Edmund suggested a simple practice. "Describe what you hear," he said, "even if it seems obvious. Speaking it makes it real for all of us." He spoke as if teaching a craft, and the others took to it with gentle seriousness. Miss Finch began. "A chain," she said softly, "clinking twice, then quiet. Perhaps someone adjusts a mooring." Mr. Ashford added, a low groan from timber, a boat settling against its tether. Clara offered, a footstep on wood, hollow, and then the river, always returning. Edmund listened and nodded. "Good," he said. "Now we all have the same map." The act of shared description did something subtle to the night. It made the fog feel less like isolation and more like a shared space in which everyone contributed light by voice. Each observation was a small lantern hung in the air, and together they created a corridor of understanding. They passed a post where a rope was tied, and Clara brushed it lightly with her hand, confirming its rough fiber. The contact made her feel steadier, as if the city were offering more than one kind of handhold. The smell of tar and damp wood grew stronger for a moment, then softened again as they moved inland a few yards. At a junction, Edmund paused. The river's sound was now slightly behind them and to the left, suggesting they had angled away. The bell rang faintly again, and its note seemed less certain here, more easily bent by open space. Edmund did not frown. He simply acknowledged the change. "The bell is not as reliable near the water," he said. "Fog plays with it more, but the river remains steady. We'll keep it in our minds." Mr. Ashford's parcel shifted as he adjusted his hold. "It is comforting," he admitted, "to have something that does not move simply because one cannot see it." "Yes," Clara said, "and it is comforting to have one another." They walked a little farther, and the river's breathing became fainter, though it never disappeared entirely. The air warmed slightly as buildings returned, and the sense of cooking and coal re-entered the mix. Still, the memory of the water's steady rhythm stayed with them. Clara noticed that their footsteps had begun to match that rhythm unconsciously, slow and even. The procession felt more assured, not because the fog had relented, but because they had learned to carry steadiness within themselves. Then, as they rounded a gentle corner, the fog shifted in a way that felt almost deliberate. For a brief stretch, it thinned just enough to reveal the faint outline of a long railing ahead and the suggestion of a signpost, its letters unreadable, but its shape unmistakable. The sight was not sharp. It was more like an impression, as if the city were offering a small hint to reward their patience. Clara stopped, her breath catching, not in fear, but in quiet surprise. "Look," she said softly, though "look" in this fog meant something different. "There's a signpost." Edmund stepped closer, careful and calm. He did not rush, but his attention sharpened. "A marker," he said. "Not clear enough to read yet, but enough to confirm we're near a known crossing." Miss Finch leaned slightly forward, listening as much as seeing. "And the railings," she added. "We can follow those." Mr. Ashford's voice held gentle satisfaction. "The city is answering," he said, recalling Clara's words outside the tea shop. "It is speaking back." Edmund turned toward them, his expression softened by lamp glow and fog alike. "We'll go to the post," he said quietly. "We'll see if it will give us a name. And if it does, we'll use it to place our next steps with even greater care." The river's breathing, now behind them, seemed to offer one last soft lap against stone, as if approving their method. The group moved forward again, guided by railings and faint outlines, and by the calm shared practice of naming what they could hear. Ahead, the signpost waited in the fog like a small invitation, an object that might, with patience, reveal a word they could carry onward. The signpost did not reveal its letters easily. The fog held it at the edge of clarity, offering the shape of iron and wood and the suggestion of a board above, but keeping the name tucked away, as if it were a private thought. Edmund led the group toward it with patient steps, railings on one side and the memory of the river behind them. The air here felt less damp than by the Thames, yet it still carried that softened quality the fog had given everything, like cloth laid over the city's usual sharpness. When they reached the post, Edmund rested his hand against it, confirming the cool iron. Clara leaned closer and tried to read by sight, but the letters remained a blur, dark strokes that refused to separate. Mr. Ashford lifted his fingertips to the board and traced the carved grooves, reading the way he had read the plaque on the painted wall. "It says," he began, then paused, brow gently furrowed. "No. The paint is thick. The letters are filled. I can feel the shape, but not the sense." Miss Finch exhaled quietly, not in frustration, but in acceptance. "Then it can be a marker without being a name," she said. Edmund nodded. "Exactly," he replied. "It tells us the crossing is real. That is enough." They moved on, following the railings as Edmund had suggested. The iron felt cold and steady when Clara brushed it with her fingers, and the bars made a faint musical sound when touched lightly, an accidental chime that reminded her of Silas Kemp's tapping pole. Their procession kept its slow rhythm, voices steady and low. Yet, as they continued, the street's shape began to behave oddly, even for a night already full of softened surprises. The pavement seemed to widen and then narrow without warning, and the familiar sense of straight ahead became strangely unreliable. The fog, so quiet in manner, began to feel like it had gently rearranged the space between buildings. Edmund slowed, listening. "We should be nearing a turn," he said, voice thoughtful. "A left, then a short stretch, then another bend." Clara tried to recall the route as she knew it, matching his description to her own memory of market roads and church corners. It fit, almost. The trouble was in the almost, that small gap where certainty frayed. Miss Finch, who had been walking with calm composure, lifted her head slightly, as if sensing the same. "It feels open," she said. "More open than a narrow street ought to feel." Mr. Ashford added, "The echo is different. Our voices don't return the same way." They came to where the turn should have been. Edmund stopped and held up a hand, and the others gathered close, not crowding, simply aligning themselves around his stillness. He stepped forward half a pace and let his boot test the ground, then paused again. In the fog's pale thickness, the street ahead looked no different from the street behind, only whiteness and the faint, dim suggestion of a lamp far away. Yet Edmund could tell something was wrong, not by sight, but by the way sound behaved. There should have been a building wall close on the left, creating a tighter echo. Instead, their quiet breathing seemed to drift outward, as if the space had opened into a broader lane. "The street is not where it should be," Edmund said gently, choosing his words with care. "Or at least, the edge of it isn't." Clara felt a faint ripple of uncertainty in her chest, but it did not rise into panic. The night had already taught them that uncertainty could be met with calm, and she held to that lesson like a warm cup held between both hands. "Then we stop," she said. "We do not argue with it." Miss Finch's voice was soft but firm. "We listen, we count, we do what we can." Edmund nodded, and in the lamplight's faint glow, his expression remained steady. "Yes," he said. "We will not rush to fix it. We will simply gather our sense again." He turned slightly, speaking to them as if guiding a small ceremony. First, stillness. They stood without moving, allowing the city's subtle sounds to emerge. A cart creaked far off. Then another answered closer, though the fog made distance difficult to judge. A door latched somewhere with a gentle click. The bell, the same patient bell that had accompanied them most of the night, rang faintly. But it arrived with a strange quality, as though the fog had shifted its direction. It did not provide clear guidance. It simply reminded them that time continued. "Second," Edmund said, "we speak what we know." Clara began. "We came from the river," she said, calm and clear. "We kept it behind us, then angled inland. We followed railings," Mr. Ashford added. "We reached a signpost we could not read. Then we continued along the iron." Miss Finch's voice joined theirs. "The air warmed as we left the water. The scent of coal returned, and the ground became slightly more even. Edmund listened, then nodded. "Good," he said. "Now, we measure." He did not mean measuring with instruments. He meant measuring with the only tool the fog could not take: attention. "We will take 10 steps back," he said, slowly, counting together. "Then we will approach again and listen at the point of the turn. If the space changes, we will know where the edge begins." They did it as he suggested, and the act of counting felt like laying down stones in a line. "1," Edmund said, stepping back. "2," Clara echoed, her voice steady. "3," Mr. Ashford added, and 4, Miss Finch continued. Their voices braided together, calm and even, until they reached 10 and stopped. Then they approached again, counting forward this time, not to hurry, but to confirm. The fog remained thick, but the street's texture beneath their boots became familiar in its own way. Damp stone, slight slope, then level. At the point where the turn should have been, Edmund paused and lifted his hand again. "Here," he said softly. "Listen." Clara spoke a single word, "Here," and heard the way it returned, not from a close wall, but from a softer distance. Miss Finch did the same, her voice gentle. Mr. Ashford tapped his boot lightly on the ground and listened for the echo. The space was indeed broader than expected, as if the street had opened or shifted. "It may be that we are not at the turn," Mr. Ashford said cautiously, "that we have drifted without noticing. Or," Clara offered, "the turn is here, but the fog is hiding the wall, making the space feel larger." Edmund considered both possibilities and did not rush to declare one correct. Instead, he proposed another method, one that felt both practical and strangely comforting. "We will use memory," he said, "not as an argument, but as a tool." He looked at each of them in turn. "Each person recalls one small detail from earlier, something you noticed, something that felt certain. We will build a chain of certainty, link by link." Mr. Ashford went first, his voice careful and sincere. "The painted wall," he said. "The plaque that said St. Bartholomew's this way. The carved letters were clean beneath my fingers." Clara followed, picturing it as she spoke. "Mrs. Ellery's shop," she said. "The seam of light at the door and the scent of tea." She said calm was free. Miss Finch added, her tone quiet, but bright with precise remembrance. "The river's breathing," she said. "The lap against stone, steady and patient, and the rope creaking like a slow chair." Edmund took his turn last. "Silas Kemp," he said, the tap of his pole and his advice. "Do not chase what the fog rearranges. Listen instead." As each memory was offered, Clara felt the group's uncertainty soften. They were no longer alone at the edge of an absent street. They were together, holding a strand of moments that proved their journey was real and coherent, even if the fog attempted to blur it. The chain of certainty did not clear the air, but it tightened something inside them. A shared confidence that the night could be navigated without force. Edmund returned his attention to the present and spoke with calm decision. "We will not try to force this turn," he said. "We will take the simplest option. We will find a wall or railings again, something we can touch. If we keep one reliable edge, we cannot drift far." He turned slightly, testing the air with his senses the way Clara might test fabric. "I feel a draft to the right," he added. "That suggests an opening, perhaps the turn, perhaps an alley. We will approach it slowly and speak as we go." They moved together, taking only a few steps, their voices low and steady. "Right side," Clara murmured, and Miss Finch echoed, "Right." Mr. Ashford extended his hand slightly, not grasping at the fog, but ready to meet whatever boundary existed. After a few more steps, his fingertips brushed something solid, wood perhaps, or brick. He exhaled softly. "Here," he said. "A surface." Edmund stepped closer and confirmed it with his own hand. "A wall," he said. "Or a fence. Enough." His voice warmed with quiet satisfaction. "We have our edge again." They aligned themselves beside it, and the space that had felt too open began to feel manageable once more. Clara rested her palm lightly against the surface and let the simple fact of solidity settle her. "We didn't need the street to be exactly where we expected," she said softly. "We only needed a way to move kindly through it." Miss Finch's reply was gentle, almost grateful. "And we needed time to remember that we can." The fog remained thick. London's edges still softened into white. Yet the group's calm had become its own kind of architecture. Something stable built from voice, attention, and pace. Edmund looked ahead into the pale corridor they had created beside the wall, and he spoke with a quiet invitation. "Let's follow this edge," he said. "Just a little farther. I believe it will bring us to a more familiar corner." As they began to move again, the bell sounded faintly behind them, steady, unhurried, as if approving their choice not to rush. And with the wall at their side and their voices aligned, the city, though still hidden, seemed ready to offer the next small certainty. The wall they had found was not as richly layered as the painted one, nor as comfortably familiar as iron railings, yet it offered what they needed most, a steady edge that did not vanish when the fog softened everything else. Edmund kept his hand close to it for a few steps, confirming its line by touch, and Clara walked beside him, palm resting lightly against the surface as though it were the arm of a patient friend. Mr. Ashford and Miss Finch followed in their practiced spacing, close enough to share voices, far enough to keep each step measured and their breathing unhurried. Behind them, the bell's note remained faint but steady, and ahead, the fog held its pale hush like a curtain drawn across a stage. As they followed the wall, the city began to offer small signs of returning familiarity, not clear views, but subtle clues that carried the weight of truth. The pavement underfoot changed from uneven cobbles to a slightly smoother stretch, and the sound of their footsteps tightened in echo, suggesting buildings closer on either side. A window somewhere opened briefly and let out a warm puff of air that smelled of soap and damp linen, then closed again with a soft click. A cat moved unseen along a ledge and gave a small conversational sound before disappearing into quiet. None of these things were dramatic, yet each one was a thread tying them back to known London. Miss Finch was the first to recognize a particular draft that brushed her cheek. She slowed half a pace and listened, then spoke with careful certainty. "There," she said softly. "A narrow passage, and..." She waited, then smiled faintly. "I can hear it. The tapping. A hammer, very light. Not close, but close enough to know it is real." Clara's expression warmed. "Your cobbler," she said. Miss Finch nodded, and the relief in her posture was gentle rather than sudden, like a knot loosening rather than a rope snapping free. "Yes," she said. "He works late when he has orders. That sound always tells me I am almost home." Edmund slowed and turned slightly toward her, keeping his voice calm and clear. "Then we'll guide you to your door first," he said. "Tell us what you know about the last turns." Miss Finch described them in measured phrases, as she had learned to do through the night. "There should be a railing that begins near a small drain," she said, "and a short stretch where the stones tilt slightly, then a door with an iron handle shaped like a leaf." She spoke without rushing, and as she spoke, The details seemed to rise in the fog like faint outlines, made not of sight, but of remembered touch. They moved toward the hammer's gentle tapping, keeping the wall until it ended naturally, then shifting carefully to railings that Miss Finch located with her fingertips. The iron was cold and thin, and the sound of it under her touch was a small, reassuring chime. "Here," she said. "This is it." Edmund confirmed it with his own hand, and Clara echoed the word "here" down the line to Mr. Ashford, ensuring no one drifted. The door itself appeared gradually, not as a clear shape, but as a darker patch in the fog, a slight interruption in the pale surface. Miss Finch reached for the handle, and when her fingers found the leaf-shaped iron, she exhaled softly, as though she had been carrying the day in her shoulders and was finally allowed to set it down. "This is my door," she said. Clara felt a quiet satisfaction. The night's work, so far, had been made of small successes like this, moments where a person's voice shifted from uncertainty to recognition. "I'm glad," Clara said gently. "You did very well." Miss Finch's smile was modest but bright. "We did," she replied, and the emphasis was important. She turned slightly toward them, careful not to step away too quickly, as if the fog might take the moment back. "Thank you," she said, looking at Edmund first, then Clara, then Mr. Ashford. "For your patience, and for speaking as if calm were something we could share." Edmund inclined his head. "It is," he said simply. Miss Finch hesitated, then added, "If you pass this way again, perhaps on a clearer evening, there is a small baker nearby who sells good oatcakes. I would be glad to point you to it." It was not quite an invitation to linger, but it was a promise of future familiarity, and it warmed the air between them. Clara nodded. "I would like that," she said. Mr. Ashford murmured agreement, and Edmund's reply was steady. "We'll remember," he said. Miss Finch lifted her bundle, opened the door, and stepped inside, and the last thing they heard before it closed was the faint continuation of the cobbler's hammer, steady, real, and near. The door shut with a quiet click that felt like punctuation, and the procession became three. They stood for a moment in the fog, listening to the street settle again. Then Mr. Ashford cleared his throat softly, not from discomfort, but to signal his own next need. "I believe I am near Smithfield now," he said. His tone held more confidence than earlier, as if the night's method had bound his thoughts into order. "If I can find the iron rail by the corner, there is a gate I recognize. An old hinge that squeaks." Clara smiled faintly. "Then we shall listen for it," she said. They walked on, their steps still measured, and with fewer voices the night felt slightly larger, yet it did not feel emptier, because the calm they had built remained. Clara continued to name what she noticed. A slope here, a doorway to the left, a draft from an alley. Edmund echoed key markers in his steady porter's tone, and Mr. Ashford added his own careful observations, his mind now attuned to detail. The bell sounded again, faint and rounded, and this time it felt like a gentle accompaniment rather than a distant signal. Near Smithfield, the air took on a different flavor. More livestock and straw than river damp, more iron and stone than soot. Even in fog, certain places declared themselves by scent and echo. Mr. Ashford slowed as if greeting an old acquaintance. "Yes," he murmured. "This is it." He extended his hand, and his fingers met a railing that was colder than the others, as though it had been exposed to open air for longer. He followed it a few steps and then paused, listening. There it was. A hinge squeak, soft but distinct, as someone opened a gate further down the lane. The sound was both ordinary and deeply personal in its specificity, and Mr. Ashford's shoulders eased. "That gate," he said. "I know it. The Patrons' building is just beyond." Edmund stepped closer, careful to keep his voice within easy reach. "Will you be all right from here?" he asked, not as a test, but as a gentle confirmation. Mr. Ashford nodded. "Yes," he said, and the word carried the firmness of someone who had proven it to himself. "I will go slowly. I will keep to the rail, and if I lose it, I will stop and listen, as we did." He glanced at Clara, his expression grateful. "You made the city feel readable again," Clara answered with quiet warmth. "You did that too," she said, "by noticing, by speaking." Mr. Ashford adjusted his parcel, then hesitated, as Miss Finch had, as though reluctant to step away from a calm circle that had formed so naturally. "If you find yourselves near Smithfield on another evening," he said, voice careful but sincere, "I would be honored to show you my shop. Bookbinding is quiet work. I think you would appreciate it." Clara's smile deepened. "I believe I would," she replied. Edmund offered a small nod of agreement. "We'll take you up on that," he said, and he meant it. Mr. Ashford stepped away, his figure fading into the fog, yet this time there was no anxious pause, no faltering uncertainty. His footsteps remained steady as he followed the rail toward the familiar gate, and soon the sound of the hinge squeak came again, closer, and then a door shut gently, as if welcoming him home. The procession became two. Edmund and Clara stood together for a moment, the fog quiet around them, the city's softened sounds passing like distant water. Without the others, their footsteps would be louder by contrast, their voices more exposed. Yet Clara did not feel uneasy. She felt a calm companionship, the kind that forms when two people have worked together with care and without hurry. "We should return," Edmund said softly. "My lodging house will be expecting its quiet." Clara nodded. "And my stall will need opening in the morning," she replied, though morning still felt far away, hidden somewhere behind the fog's white curtain. They began to walk back through the streets they had navigated together, and something subtle happened. The fog did not feel as confusing now. It was still thick, still softening edges, but their calm had become a habit, and habit is a powerful lantern. Along the way, they passed a solitary man moving cautiously. Clara spoke gently to him, offering a simple direction, and the man's posture eased. They passed a pair of women standing uncertainly near a corner. Edmund paused and gave a few calm words, and the women began to move with steadier steps. It was as if the steadiness the procession had cultivated was now leaving a faint trace behind them, a quiet order in the air, a reassurance carried by voice. At last, the lodging house lamp appeared as a warmer glow in the whiteness, and Edmund's door emerged like a familiar promise. He opened it and let Clara step into the entry, where the air was warmer and the polished wood shone softly. For a moment, they stood there, not rushing to part. The night had made them companions in a way daylight might never have arranged. Clara glanced toward the street outside, where the fog still waited. "It's strange," she said softly, "how a night that hides everything can make people more visible to one another." Edmund's reply was steady and thoughtful. "Because we had to use our voices," he said. "And when voices are kind, they make a place to stand." Clara's gaze moved to the small brass bell on the counter, and she felt, in its quiet gleam, the memory of all the moments that had brought them here. Knocks at thresholds, seams of light, the river's breathing, the sound of a hinge, the warmth of shared words. "If the fog returns another night," she said, "we'll know what to do." Edmund nodded, and his tone carried a gentle invitation rather than a demand. "If you like," he said, "tomorrow evening, if the air is clearer." We can meet near the market corner, not because we expect trouble, but because it would be good to see the streets as themselves again." Clara smiled, the expression warm and quiet. "I would like that," she replied. Outside, the fog continued its patient presence, but inside the lodging house, a simple plan had been made. An ordinary meeting promised after an extraordinary night, with calm as the thread that would carry it forward. The night did not end with a dramatic clearing, as if London might throw open its curtains and announce itself restored. Instead, the fog behaved as it had all along, patient, courteous, and slow to change its mind. It remained pressed against the windows and pooled in the lanes, turning the street lamps into small, floating moons. Yet in the hours after Clara's soft goodbye at the lodging house threshold, the whiteness began to loosen almost imperceptibly, as though the city were quietly exhaling. Edmund returned to his desk, the familiar ledger open before him, but the numbers and names felt less important than usual. He kept the lamp steady and listened to the building's small sounds, as he always did. A stair creak from above, a latch turning, the low murmur of someone speaking in a room beyond. Outside, the fog's hush held the street close, yet now, Edmund could distinguish more layers within it. The footfalls of passers-by, a cart rolling slowly, the faint ring of a bell far off. Each sound seemed slightly clearer than it had been earlier, and Edmund realized with quiet satisfaction that his own attention had changed. He was no longer listening out of duty alone. He was listening as if the city were a companion whose mood mattered. From time to time, he opened the door and looked out, not searching for certainty, but receiving whatever the night offered. The air still smelled of damp stone, but it also carried the faintest suggestion of morning's approach, a cooler freshness, a hint of chimney smoke from newly stirred fires, the delicate promise of bread somewhere beginning to warm. The fog remained, yet its density had shifted from wall to vale. Edmund could see a little farther than before, enough to make out the nearest lamppost clearly, enough to see the line of the curb without leaning close. In her rooms behind the market, Clara woke to a world that still felt softened, but no longer lost. The window glass was clouded with moisture, and beyond it, the street looked pale and quiet, like a sketch not fully inked. She moved through her simple morning routine with a gentle steadiness, the same steadiness she had used the night before when speaking directions into the fog. As she tied her hair back and arranged her shawl, she found herself repeating the little methods they had learned. Pause, listen, name what you know. It was oddly comforting to discover that such methods belonged not only to the fog, but to any moment that asked for patience. When she stepped outside, the market street greeted her with a hush that was not empty, but restful. The fog still clung to the cobbles, yet it was thinner now, and the shapes of buildings returned in soft outlines. She could see the market stalls as gray forms in a row, like folded tents waiting to be opened. Somewhere, a broom scraped steadily along stone as a shopkeeper swept the doorstep. A kettle whistled behind a shuttered window. A bird, bold enough to sing even when the world was pale, offered a small, clear note that seemed to stitch the air together. Clara walked toward her stall and began to unfasten the canvas cover. Her fingers moved with familiar precision, and the simple work felt grounding after the night's strange navigation. As she shook out the cloth and folded it neatly, she noticed something on the cobbles nearby, a faint dark pattern, irregular and damp, leading away from the market corner. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. Footprints, many of them, pressed into the moisture left by fog. They overlapped and crossed, some confident, some hesitant, some clustered together as if people had paused and listened before choosing a direction. She crouched slightly, studying the marks with the quiet interest she usually gave to fabric and stitching. The prints were not dramatic evidence. They were simple impressions of souls, softened by water. Yet they felt meaningful because she could imagine the stories behind them. Here, a set of small steps had stopped and turned, as if the person had sought a familiar edge. There, a pair of prints walked close together for a time, then separated. The fog had hidden faces and signs, but it had not hidden the fact of people moving through it, making careful choices. Clara straightened and looked along the line of prints as they faded into the thinning whiteness. She felt a gentle warmth at the thought that last night's slow procession was not entirely invisible. Even if no one else knew the details of it, the street had kept a quiet record. Later, as the morning gathered itself more firmly, the fog continued to retreat, not vanishing, but thinning enough to let London's usual colors return. Brick deepened from gray to red. Iron railings became crisp, black lines rather than suggestions. The market's sounds grew more defined. The call of a vendor arranging produce, the clink of metal weights, the murmur of early customers. Clara opened her stall and began to set out ribbons and cloth with practiced care. The work was ordinary, yet she felt as though she were doing it in a slightly new way, with more attention to small textures and the soft music of the street. Edmund's morning duties carried him briefly beyond the lodging house door as well. A few guests departed early, apologizing for the strange weather as if the fog had been arranged to inconvenience them personally. Edmund answered with the mild reassurance he had learned to offer so naturally the night before. "It will lift when it's ready," he said, and his tone made the sentence feel like fact rather than hope. He watched people step out, noted how their footsteps sounded clearer now, and felt a quiet pleasure at the return of ordinary distance. You could hear a cart and know roughly where it was again. You could hear a voice and trust it to come from the direction it belonged. Near mid-morning, the bell they had followed so often the night before rang again, not muffled now, but crisp and clean in the clearer air. The sound traveled with confidence, and Edmund paused in the lodging house entry to listen. It was not a compass today. It was simply itself. Yet it carried a private meaning for him now, a reminder of how sound had become a lantern when sight had failed. When Edmund stepped out later to collect a small delivery, the fog had thinned enough that the streets felt properly shaped again. The city did not look like a dream any longer. It looked like London. Still, Edmund noticed how people moved. Some walked briskly as they always did, eager to reclaim routine. Others walked a little slower than usual, as if reluctant to let go of the night's gentler pace. A woman paused at a corner and waited for another person to catch up before turning together. A man held the door for a stranger without impatience. These were small courtesies, not unusual in themselves, yet they seemed more visible now, as if the fog had taught the city to notice its own kindness. In the late afternoon, as the light shifted toward evening, Clara glanced often toward the market corner, remembering the quiet plan she and Edmund had made. It was a simple meeting, nothing dramatic, no urgent purpose, but it held a pleasant promise, not because they expected the fog to return, but because it felt right to greet the streets again when they were clear, to see the corners that had vanished and the railings that had guided them by touch. It felt like closing a book gently after a strange chapter, then opening it again to find the familiar type. When evening arrived, the air was clearer and the lamps looked properly bright. Clara closed her stall at the usual time and walked toward the agreed corner, her steps unhurried. The city's sounds were lively again, carriages moving with more confidence, voices carrying further, a public house spilling laughter into the street. Yet Clara found herself listening differently, as if she could still hear, beneath all the ordinary noise, the softer layer that had carried them through the fog, the way calm voices made space. Edmund arrived at the corner with his hands in his coat pockets and a steady expression that softened into a faint smile when he saw her. The fog was mostly gone now, leaving only a light haze near the river, and the street lamps cast long, clear pools of light. For a moment, they simply stood in the ordinary evening and let it feel like itself. "It's strange," Clara said quietly, "how clear everything looks, and yet I feel I know it better than before." Edmund nodded. "Because we listened," he replied, "and because we didn't hurry." They walked a short distance together, not because they needed to guide anyone now, but because the act of walking side by side felt like a continuation of the night's gentle lesson. They paused at a railing and touched the iron lightly, as if greeting an old friend. They passed a wall where faded notices still clung, and Clara smiled at the memory of reading by touch. The bell rang again, crisp and bright in the clear air, and both of them looked up instinctively, sharing the private understanding that sound could be a lantern even in daylight. At last, they returned to the market corner, where the cobbles were dry and the day's footprints had long since been swept away. Clara looked down, imagining the damp impressions she had seen that morning. "The street kept a record of us," she said softly, more to herself than to Edmund. Edmund followed her gaze and understood. "And we've kept a record of the street," he replied. They stood in the lamplight a moment longer, letting the evening settle around them. The great fog of 1873 had passed, leaving London intact, yet it had also left something else behind, an unspoken habit of calm, a shared knowledge that when the world becomes unclear, people can guide one another with steady voices and a slower rhythm. As they parted with quiet warmth and an easy promise to meet again, the city's ordinary sounds seemed to carry a gentler undertone, as if London itself had learned to speak more softly when it mattered.